thanks very much, and thanks very much for asking me. I'm really looking forward to this. Forgive the notes, but I want to make sure I say what I intended to say rather than something I'm provoked to at the moment. I also feel a bit of a fraud because this event's called Future Shock, and I want to talk about something that I think should be not a shock, but should be super normal, and should not be the future, but should be now. And that's the idea that no one should be living on less than $1.25 a day, and that the eradication of poverty should, can, and will happen. Now, DI is a really small organisation, and we were even tinier. And when we were tiny, we didn't have to have a business plan, and we didn't have to have a strategy, but as we got bigger, we had to write things down. And when we wrote down what we were about, we wrote down that we were about the eradication of extreme poverty by 2025. And the first bit we were really happy about. The second bit we tended to say a bit sotto voce, if that's how you say it, because we felt slightly self-conscious about it. We thought people would think it was naive. When President Obama was elected, one of the first things he said was that we will set our sights on the eradication of extreme poverty in our time. And if you don't set a date for something, it means it's not important, and it means the timeline is never. So we are committed to the eradication of absolute poverty by 2025. Now, we're also a numbers organisation, so we've tried to pull for this afternoon some numbers that may help feed this debate a bit. And my colleagues at the back, 4 of my colleagues at the back, who've kindly paid good money to come and hear me talk, possibly other people too, of course, where they can hear me for nothing in the office, have put a lot of this data together, so I'm going to blame them if I see anything wrong on the screen. And I was also very taken with the idea of taking the 100 people in this room and trying to do the graphs with people, especially as it's the end of the afternoon, and numbers can be a bit of an effort at the end of the afternoon, but I decided that might be a bridge too far. However, you might like just to think about a couple of things when I go onto the graphs. One is, just think in your mind, how much public expenditure do you think Britain spends on aid? What do you think is the percentage of public expenditure? And the other is, what do you think an average Indian earns in a year? Just bear those 2 things in mind and see if you're surprised or not by the data. So first of all, the really good news. Extreme poverty, under $1.25 a day, which is the international poverty line, is falling. 1980, 40% of the population of developing countries, the green line at the bottom, were living on less than $1.25 a day. We estimate, the bank estimates, that by 2025, that's going to be just over 10%. But in a world of 9 billion people, 10% is a lot of people. And in other countries, the trajectory is much slower. And if nothing changes, if we just take those numbers forward and see when would you actually get to the point where nobody is living at that level, then we're looking at 2080. In sub-Saharan Africa. That's a lot of lifetimes. So if things are going to change, we need a target and we need a timetable. But actually, poverty eradication is already happening, has already happened. In Bristol, before the last war, 1938, 10% of families were living in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty, meaning they didn't have enough money for the very basic minimum necessary. And if you look at the way that's defined, it's pretty narrow. In 1950, in Britain, 1.5%. And if you look at the things that have happened since the war, Oxfam wasn't set up in response to famine in Africa or Asia. It was set up in response to famine in Greece. Adults were dying of malnutrition in the 1940s. Of the countries that now give aid, only 2 have not been aid recipients in the last 60 years. So the eradication of poverty in our own societies is something that has been going on. It's not this nirvana that will never happen. It's something that you can plan for and you can achieve. Now, I think this is the most exciting slide in the pack. Brazil had 20 million people living in absolute poverty at the beginning of this slide in the early 1990s, 1992. It's had a targeted program of eradicating poverty, and now that number has come down to about 11 million people. But what's really, really inspiring about this is that Brazil's President, Dilma Rousseff, has committed to the eradication, not just reducing, the eradication of poverty in Brazil by 2015. Now, this isn't some airy-fairy commitment. This is specific. This is based on Brazil's central registry of the names and addresses of people who are currently living in poverty, and on a detailed plan of how those people are going to be lifted out of poverty. Because poverty isn't just about income. Poverty is multidimensional, has many facets which interact with each other and make people increasingly poor. So discrimination, lack of access to services, insecurity, being forced into choices that are against your own future well-being and your children's future well-being. But Brazil is going about this in a one-by-one way of lifting people above the poverty line by 2015, and they're on track to do so. Now, it's obviously relatively uncontroversial when a country says that it's going to eradicate poverty within its own borders. We all think that's marvellous. But when it comes to the international commitment and the responsibility for eradicating poverty, that's much, much more controversial. And India is a very current case in point, with a lot of discussion in the UK about whether we in Britain should be giving aid to India. We thought a few numbers might help. There are as many people living on less than $1.25 in India as there are in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. But actually, if you look at the attention in the media and the attention in NGOs, it tends to focus on poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Somehow, in our discussion about India, we've managed to airbrush this huge number of people living in extreme poverty out of the picture. And I think we also forget how big the income gap is. This is the daily per capita income in Britain. So if you take our total gross national income and you divide it by the population, from children to pensioners to working people, then it works out at £61 a day. If you look at India, it's £2.48 on the same basis. If you look at poor countries in Africa, it's going to be less than 50 pence. Or if you look at it in another way, how long does it take us to earn the annual income in another country? I'm in a rather well-paid job. Probably takes me a short day to earn what an average citizen in Burundi earns. And for an average UK citizen, a couple of days is what it takes us to earn the total annual income of an individual in Burundi or DRC. Bihar, one of India's poorest states, 5 days. Sorry if you can't see them at the back. And for India as a whole, 2 weeks. Now, these figures are probably slightly understated for India because the data's not as recent as we'd like it to be. But even if you double that, you've got a very, very big income differential between India and the UK. But poverty means much more than addressing income. And in particular, what we have to be careful about is recognizing that people in poverty exist in most countries, and that as the world gets richer, we're going to find that we've got fewer concentrations of countries where everybody is poor, and actually there's going to be poverty spread across many, many countries. So we need both a national and an international system to address that. Now, one of the touchstones of international commitment to eradicate poverty is aid. And we have to be very careful here, because aid is by no means the most important resource for eradicating poverty. Many other things are more important. But it is the thing that is dedicated unambiguously to reducing poverty as its goal. So we need to use that resource very carefully, and we need to target it on absolute poverty. Now, I asked you a moment or two ago about what you thought about the share of public expenditure that went on aid. In the UK, I think I'm so proud that we have this cross-party consensus on achieving our target for British aid of 0.7% of GDP, and that it's been robust enough to withstand, to be operationalised in an environment where many other departments are having reductions. But even so, that's costing us 1.2% of our public expenditure, £1.20 in every £100. US, the world's biggest aid donor, less than 50 cents in every dollar of public expenditure is spent on aid. That's by way of a little pinch of salt that can be added to some of the discussion about how much aid costs us and whether we should be doing it. Almost all public opinion polls on public expenditure are faulty because nobody has any idea in the public how much public expenditure is spent on any particular sector, and they almost always think it's too much. So the whole concept is a bit devalued, but particularly with aid, people habitually overstate the amount that they think a country is spending on poverty reduction internationally. And if you look at us overall as a donor community in the complete pie, we're spending less than 1/3% of our annual wealth on aid. Now, having said that, I want to come back to the future shock thing. And while I'm doing so, I'm just going to put this slide up that if nothing changes, it's going to be 2080 before we get to the eradication of poverty. Because although this seems like a massive goal at one level, at another level, it seems to me ridiculously low. And in a society and in global environment like ours, to be unable to deliver that level, that basic level of security to each citizen seems to me not a huge goal, but an eminently achievable goal. And I think Ali referred to different generations. Obviously, as you get older, you become much more aware, I think, of how fast the world changes and of the potential for huge, huge change. And these things can seem shocking beforehand, and then they become completely normal when they happen. So in 1964, in the US, before voting rights were introduced for universal suffrage, the idea of an African-American president would have seemed shocking for the future. 44 years later, we've got one. Women didn't have the vote in Switzerland until 1971. It's incredible, incredible but true. So in 1970, maybe the idea that 1/3 of the MPs would be women in Switzerland now would be shocking. But it's perfectly normal to us now. The first SMS message was sent in 1993. Now, practically everyone in Africa has a mobile phone. The number of subscriptions are huge and are transforming commerce, security, family life. But if you said in 1993, there'll be 600 million mobile phone subscribers in Africa, people would have thought that was completely potty. And this is my final point. I've talked a lot about income, but actually poverty is about power, lack of power. Not having the ability to make choices and to control your own life. And as we all know, pretty much every moment of every day, information is what gives us power. So just imagine a future where you had basic income security and people had access to the information which could transform their lives. I don't think that should be future shock. I think that should be future normal. That's it, folks. Thanks.